We've got a massive corporate event unfolding in the New Zealand fuel market, and it is forcing the country to confront some really existential questions about its energy future.
It really is.
We are talking about the proposed acquisition of Z Energy by the Australian fuel giant Ampol.
And this isn't just about, two companies merging their spreadsheets. This is a high-stakes deal where the regulatory requirements have collided directly with the harsh reality of the nation's new, highly fragile energy supply chain.
That's the core tension we're diving into. Ampol wants to acquire 100% of Z Energy shares. They're offering NZ $3.78 per share, plus a little extra for delays. But the defining feature, the thing that makes this so fascinating, is the one condition they absolutely must meet.
The non-negotiable condition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ampol has to completely divest its existing New Zealand business, Gull.
Absolutely. The regulator is basically walking a tightrope.
Right.
On one side, they have to preserve competitive pricing, which is what forcing the sale of Gull is all about. But on the other side, they have to face these huge structural risks that are now just baked into the system since the Marsden Point refinery closed.
So it's this delicate, maybe even contradictory relationship between market competition and national resilience.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by defining the immense infrastructure Z Energy controls, because that, to me, seems like the hidden value Ampol is really buying.
Well, let's start with the two giants. Ampol, the applicant, is huge. It's Australian-based, operates nearly 1,900 service stations over there.
So a massive player?
A massive player. And their only New Zealand footprint right now is Gull.
And Z Energy is the powerful incumbent here in New Zealand. Retail-wise, they own nearly 200 Z-branded sites and supply another, 130-something Caltex stations.
That's right. But like you said, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's the physical assets that make Z so indispensable.
What kind of assets are we talking about?
They own fuel storage terminals, pipelines, truck loading facilities, basically the country's circulatory system for fuel. And most critically, Z is a joint owner in major logistics infrastructure.
Like KOL, you mentioned that before.
Exactly. Coastal Oil Logistics Limited, or KOL. They co-own that alongside BP and Mobil.
Okay, wait, let's stop on KOL for a second. Why is that joint ownership so critical to the system? What is it?
That's a great question. TOL is essentially the aorta of the North Island's fuel distribution. It manages the main pipeline that runs from the Marsden Point import terminal down to Auckland.
So everything flows through that one pipe.
A huge amount does, yes. It also manages storage and distribution in other critical areas. If you control a piece of KL, you have a direct say in how fuel moves, where it's stored, and by extension, how easily new competitors can get access to the wholesale market.
So Z Energy's stake gives them inherent market power.
That's it. It makes them central to the whole network.
Which brings us to the regulatory red line. If Z is already that powerful, bringing in a massive international player like Ampol would just be too much concentration.
Correct. That's why the divestment of Gull is mandatory. Ampol has to sell the entire Gull business.
The entire business, not just a few stations.
The whole thing. They have two options: a trade sale to an approved buyer or an initial public offering, an IPO. The regulator insisted that Gull had to remain a viable, fiercely competitive business after the sale.
So how do they guarantee that? How does the new Gull, once it's sold, still get fuel? It's not like it has its own refinery.
That's where the contract structure is key. Ampol has to enter into a long-term fuel supply agreement with whoever buys Gull. They call it the PIE agreement.
PIE.
Product Import and Export Agreement. It basically guarantees that Gull can keep importing refined fuel on competitive arm's-length terms.
Okay, so they're not left high and dry.
Not at all. And they might even get a Transitional Services Agreement, a TSA, to help with the logistics of the switchover. It ensures the new Gull hits the ground running.
And this whole structural maneuver is designed specifically to preserve something the regulators really value: the Gull effect.
Yes.
Let's focus on that. Why is this small-ish operator so critical?
It's fascinating, really. Gull is not the market leader by any stretch, but the regulator calls them a significant competitive force, a challenger brand.
Because they're cheap.
Because they're aggressive on price. That's the official term they became famous for.
Right. They were always the ones forcing the price down on the corner where they had a site.
Exactly. The finding is that this behavior leads to significantly lower prices in markets where Gull is present. They're the market's disruptor. They keep the big guys Z, BP, Mobil honest.
So the Gull effect is the competitive anchor. But here's the question. If Gull is now owned by someone new, How can the regulator be sure that this new owner will maintain that same strategy?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. And it's the risk they're trying to minimize with that PIE supply agreement.
The hope being that if their wholesale costs are low, they'll keep competing on price.
That's the theory. Ampol itself admitted there were 67 local markets where Gull and Zia Caltex stations overlapped within a 2-kilometer radius.
67?
67 areas where price competition could have just vanished overnight without this forced sale.
And this is all happening while other changes are trying to level the playing field too, right? Like the Fuel Industry Act from 2020.
It absolutely is. That act introduced something called terminal gate pricing, or TGP. To simplify, it means every wholesale supplier has to publicly post their spot price at the terminal.
Ah, so it creates transparency.
Total transparency.
Yeah.
It makes it much easier for independent distributors to know if they're getting a fair deal, and ultimately makes it easier for smaller players to switch suppliers and undercut retail prices.
And we are seeing other players take advantage of this new openness.
We are. Look at Waitomo. They've got over 50 retail stations and are expanding aggressively into Wellington and the South Island. Then there's NPD, building new sites and pushing into the North Island.
So the divestiture of Gull is just adding another major piece to an already shifting competitive landscape.
It is. It could introduce a third or even fourth serious challenger in the next few years.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Connecting the merger to the macro picture. New Zealand's fuel vulnerability.
This is the pivot.
Because this merger scrutiny is happening just as the country is reckoning with its own fuel security.
A huge reckoning. Since the Marsden Point refinery closed in March 2022, New Zealand is 100% reliant on imported refined fuels. Petrol, diesel, jet fuel, all of it.
And what's the scale of that?
Total national demand is about 24 million liters every single day.
Wow. And the fuel security study showed that this dependency is highly concentrated, right?
Very. Over 70% of our refined fuel now comes from just a couple of massive Asian refining hubs, mainly South Korea and Singapore.
And how long does that journey take?
It's a 16 to 17-day trip across the ocean. So any international shock, geopolitical conflict, a natural disaster shutting down a port, it can immediately translate into extreme price shocks and supply disruptions here.
Let's quantify that. What does a major global event really feel like for the economy?
The analysis is genuinely sobering. They modeled a disruption impacting just 20% of global supply.
Just 20%.
And that alone is estimated to cause an economic loss of 0.72% of GDP.
In dollar terms?
That's NZ $2.4 billion in lost economic activity. And that's factoring in the crippling effect on aviation.
$2.4 billion. That's a massive hit. And the price shock sounds even more immediate.
Oh, it is. The study projected that a hypothetical North Asian disruption could cause price hikes nearly double what we saw during the 2022 Ukraine conflict.
Double.
We're talking up to 184% for jet fuel and 116% for diesel. Just imagine your weekly fuel bill more than doubling overnight. That's the kind of exposure we have now.
That's a powerful incentive to look for solutions. But wait, we've talked international risks. What about domestic risks? The infrastructure that Z Energy owns part of, isn't that just as dangerous?
They're modeled to pose the highest risk of economic impact. A global shock is bad, but markets eventually adjust. A domestic interruption is devastating because it halts distribution immediately. The fuel could be sitting in a tank at the port, but if the pipeline is down, it can't get to the pumps.
So a long-term disruption at a single choke point, like the main Marsden Point terminal, that's the greatest point of failure.
Exactly. A disruption there is modeled to cause a significant GDP loss. It shows how fragile that core infrastructure is, the very infrastructure Ampol is trying to buy a dominant stake in.
And this risk isn't going away, especially as demand shifts. Petrol use is going down with EVs.
Right, but diesel demand for farming and transport stays high. And jet fuel, which is vital for tourism, is forecast to rise. So the pressure on these few fragile points is actually increasing.
Okay, let's shift to solutions. If the risks are that clear, what are the most effective strategies to build resilience?
The study did a pretty rigorous cost-benefit analysis. And what came out on top as the most compelling, cost-effective solution for the long term is accelerating the transition to zero-emission vehicles, EVs and hydrogen fuel cells.
How does that compare cost-wise to just trying to shore up the old fossil fuel system?
The numbers are stark. Accelerating the transition is incredibly effective and cheap, relatively speaking. The estimated annual cost is only around NZ $129 million.
And for that, you get?
You mitigate about 90 million liters of fossil fuel demand every year. You're not just managing the risk, you're removing the source of the risk entirely.
That's remarkably cheap for that level of impact. What about other options like more storage?
Better physical stock management is another solid option, increasing diesel storage and critically increasing jet fuel storage. Developing a local biorefinery is also viable.
How much would that cost?
It could displace 215 million liters of fossil fuel a year, but the cost is higher, around $257 million annually. So still better than legacy solutions, but double the cost of just transitioning vehicles.
And what about the most expensive options? Rebuilding the old way.
That's the ultimate opportunity cost disaster. Reestablishing the full Marsden Point refinery is estimated at $756 million annually.
$756 million a year.
For minimal security improvement, because you're still dependent on vulnerable crude oil supply chains. And a smaller refinery, just for local crude, would only supply maybe 1 to 2% of diesel demand in an emergency. The numbers are overwhelming.
They really are. They favor the $129 million route, getting off fossil fuels, rather than spending $756 million a year to protect the old system that's causing the problem in the first place.
And that cost comparison directly impacts the long-term value of the very assets Ampol is buying.
That's the critical link. Z Energy's value is tied up in pipelines and terminals. If the government is logically mandated to spend $129 million to accelerate the transition away from fuel, it fundamentally devalues the importance of Z's physical infrastructure over the next decade.
Precisely. The merger forced a valuable competitive asset, Gull, back onto the market, just as the country is reckoning with these profound security concerns. And the analysis shows the most expensive solutions protect the old infrastructure, while the cheapest, highest impact solution makes that same infrastructure progressively less relevant.
So what does this all mean? The market is banking on a smooth transition to imports, but the study shows domestic infrastructure failure is the single largest financial risk. The cost of aggressively subsidizing a shift to EVs is far, far lower than the cost of trying to protect this legacy fossil fuel system.
This is not financial advice.
Of course.
But based on the data, you have immense high-cost risk associated with domestic infrastructure failure, which directly impacts Z Energy's fixed assets. And you have the clear cost benefit of the accelerated transition plan. The trade targets that gap.
Go on.
You would place a strategic long-term bet against Z Energy's core infrastructure, predicting its depreciation as the government inevitably follows the economic logic and accelerates that $129 million transition plan.
And on the other side of that trade,
you go long on the first serious NZX-listed entity, specializing in heavy vehicle hydrogen infrastructure, or maybe high-speed EV charging networks. You're betting that political logic will eventually have to follow the economic data. The opportunity is created by the massive cost difference between the $756 million nightmare and the $129 million solution.